Did you say back channel or bat channel?
Well, I guess for some organizations it might be bat, but I
Both.
said bat.
Both appropriate.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone, to the Profit Meets Purpose podcast presented by Constant Method, where we explore how for-profit companies can thrive while supporting nonprofits and their missions. Whether you're a new startup or an existing company trying to launch a product or service aimed at the nonprofit market, this podcast exists to help you discover what it takes to create impact and profit by supporting those who serve others.
Welcome, everyone, to the Profit Meets Purpose podcast. This is the second in a three-part series talking about the fundamentals of selling to and supporting nonprofits. Last week, we spoke about the fundamentals of nonprofits themselves. And today, we're specifically diving into the people, the employees, how they operate within those nonprofits. If we use terminology that you don't understand, I would encourage you to go back and listen to last week's episode on our Nonprofits 101, talking about the fundamentals of nonprofits themselves. But for today, I'm welcoming in again the entire Constant Method team. I've got Casey Bowers, who's our principal customer success consultant, Kevin Kramer, who's all things sales, partnerships, product, and Maria as our resident nonprofit person. Again, we'll kick it off with you this week. And I'm going to put you on the spot and ask, what is the best thing about working for a nonprofit and what's the worst thing?
That's a great question. And I guess I should answer since I was there for many, many decades. And like most nonprofits leaders, it's a choice. You've made a choice to work there. And I think the best thing about it is knowing that you're bringing your talent and you're dedicating your hard work and commitment to a good cause that benefits, brings good into the universe. And it's not just helping a CEO make more money or shareholders make more money. And I know that's, kind of minimalizing everyone's work, but it does feel good to make an impact. And when you hear the stories of people.
Well, I'm going to jump in and ask.
Go ahead.
I don't think we've ever talked about this. In your experience, what percentage of people truly are dedicated to the mission that are working there? I have to assume that there are some people that do view it just as a job.
They do. It is a job. It is a job. It's not viewed as a job. It's a job. And you can have a good career there. But I would say that you can't work for a nonprofit very long. Hear the gratitude and the appreciation of the people that are impacted by your mission and not feel really good about what you do. So we'll go 98%. 98%. Okay. Yeah. The worst part, I think, is just missed opportunities. Talented people know what they can, what they should, what they wish they were doing, but sometimes they're limited by the resources available. They may not have the money for an investment. They may not have the funds to add staff, which they know would grow the mission. So making do with what you have is often what nonprofits are left, to do, and they do it very well, but they know they could be doing more. And there's also unrealistic expectations from the public. They expect every nonprofit to be operating just like Amazon does. And that's not realistic, but you do the best you can. But I know that everyone in their heart knows, I wish I could do this, or I know we could do more. So I think that's the hardest part.
When you say,
go ahead, I'm going to ask this though. What do you mean by operate like Amazon?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask.
Well, you expect when you make a donation that the response is going to be immediate. The thank you is going to be in the mail the next day. If you ordered a t-shirt on an organization's website, that it's going to get there within 24 hours. And those types of operations are not always possible with nonprofits. So the expectation is that this customer service, the relationship building, the activation is going to be exactly like you experience in the for-profit world, but that's not always possible.
But I would say, though, would you agree that people don't expect it to operate like Amazon in the fact that, classically, Amazon lost money for, their first 20 years and spent like crazy. But those nonprofit employees are held to an entirely different standard in that, the financials and the amount of money that they are spending goes under a microscope way more than something like Amazon, right?
Oh yeah, everything we do. So the expectation is there that we do better, perform better, do everything quicker, but then the scrutiny is there as well. Like, why did you spend money on overnight delivery? That doesn't seem appropriate. You're taking money away from the mission. So it's a double edge. You're scrutinized for every penny that you spend, and that's public information. And, everyone has the ability to question it, and we consider our donors our investors, and they should question it. But then the expectations are still there. You should be doing more for less. Shouldn't pay for your employees. They should do it because they love the job. But you need to do it better. You need to do more. Why don't you advertise, like you see on, with for-profits? Why don't you tell more people about what you do? So it's a double-edged sword. And that's really, really hard.
And then, so naturally, I'm going to lead that into Kevin to say, we may have people who are listening who have traditionally sold into or worked for companies that are in B2B settings where they operate with for-profits. So in your experience, knowing what Maria just said, for people who are the employees that you're calling on from a sales perspective, they are scrutinized over every single dollar. How does that change things when you're thinking about it from the employee perspective of like, this is someone at a nonprofit who really is going to get scrutinized for the budget and every dollar they spend versus when you're selling into a traditional for-profit B2B world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the scrutiny, and we talked a little bit about this in the last episode, is that they're usually forced, especially if they don't have large budgets, they're usually forced to make prioritized decisions, meaning if this is an initiative that's of interest to me and I want to go down this path and it's going to solve a problem for our organization and allow us to advance the mission, it probably means I'm deciding to not do something else. And that part is really critical to understand. When you think about competitive landscape, am I going against another technology or another service? That may be one aspect of it that does the same thing that I'm doing, or it could be that, hey, we're going to park a different initiative for now and move forward or not move forward with a product or solution that you have. I think that's a big part of the landscape. I think the other piece that I would call to mind is a little bit about, I think some of the roles that you find at an organization. A lot of times when we think about, an executive director, for example, they are, for lack of a better term, the CEO of the organization, and they're thinking very broadly around all the things. It may be that they think a little bit about fundraising because that's revenue. They think about spend and funding the mission. They think about volunteers. They think about events. They carry sort of a very broad view of the world. The other piece to that is that they report to a board that typically is very involved, especially if you get into any level of spending where they need to get approval. That board approval, that board involvement is a pretty critical aspect of that as well.
And to dive in on a title that you said there, executive director, because I think I could argue that there's probably no one-to-one at a for-profit company in that same role, because many nonprofits, right, do have, especially at the large level, do have CEOs. Yeah. How would you equate for somebody who's kind of new to this world? How would you describe the executive director's responsibilities compared to like a for-profit environment?
I likened it to a CEO, but the reality is like they own everything about the organization. And I'll give you a good example. So I'm a volunteer for Meals on Wheels here in Mount Pleasant. The executive director, George Roberts, he literally is involved with everything. They're making and packing meals. He's working with volunteers. He's doing the fundraising. He's reporting to the board. He's into the grant process and everything in between. They literally own the business top to bottom. They're the ones that are accountable to the board as well. And so everything in that case channels through that executive director. Even if I start my conversations with the database administrator on technology that might help them do their job, ultimately it's going to channel through that executive director.
I have
And
to
I
believe
thought
it.
I was
Go
gonna
ahead, Maria.
I was executive director for many, many years in North Texas. And one thing, you're 100% spot on, Kevin, but one thing that you didn't mention is being the face of the organization.
Yeah.
And I think
Great call out.
that's, maybe you liken it to a regional director in the for-profit world or somebody that owns a territory. And so one of the biggest roles I had was the image and reputation of the organization in that geographic region, or if it's nationwide. Like, you have to be the face of the organization that people know and trust. And it takes a lot of work developing partnerships with the right organizations, being at the table for civic opportunities. And so that's a huge part of being an executive director, beyond just operations.
It's a great call out.
Casey, I'll throw it over to you as well, because what Kevin is saying there, I'm going to assume it's very dependent on the size of the organization. In your experience, you've worked with huge nonprofits, but also very small nonprofits. And I'm assuming the small nonprofit, the executive director, has more of those responsibilities. Can you compare and contrast those organizations you've worked with over the years and what those relationships are like with those types of people, if there are three people at the organization versus 300 or 3,000?
Yeah, three. So if we're looking at like smaller organizations, you're looking at the three people that are working with you. They kind of have, they have to take on more responsibility, right? You don't have a person that has like a designated lane like you would like a larger organization. So with smaller organizations, they have like executive director, but that executive director, while they have to make those like large strategic plans, they have to look at operational efficiencies, budgets, all of that. They actually have to take on more responsibility of being like more hands-on, right? So they actually might have to be part of, if you're starting a new partnership with a vendor in tech, they might actually have to oversee the project, right? And they work closely with somebody who would be more the day-to-day, but they have to oversee like how much effort gets put into that project and how they prioritize that project. Very different than a larger organization.
And so, Kevin, can you kind of break down how that would look and feel differently from an outreach perspective? If you're talking about an organization that has like this huge organizational hierarchy where the top level people that you might be going after are very far removed from like the delivery of the mission, compared to the smaller organizations like the one you just mentioned, where the person doing the fundraising is also like packing up meals. How does that change the outreach that you're doing from like a sales perspective, or the conversations that you're having with them and the questions that you're asking?
Great question. I think in my experience, the first layer is usually the person that's closest to the problem or challenge, the person that's on the front line, if you will, that feels the everyday challenge, if you will. In terms of questions and discovery and things like that, I mean, the first thing I would always try and do is to understand like not only what those problems and challenges are, but what value we could provide, and not just to that person, but to the organization at large. In those larger organizations that have layers of people, if you will, the only way you're going to get access to other folks or engagement with other folks in there is really to earn trust from the people that you're talking with. We talked about this in the last episode. I mean, understanding their drivers and mission and being empathetic to that is really important as part of this trust. But finding paths and questions to ask about the reach. And so I'll give you an example. A database administrator might have a problem because integration is not working. Something takes a lot of time. Their headspace is in, hey, I need something that's more efficient. This is causing me challenges here in my day-to-day life. To expand that out a little bit, the reality is like, it's not just time savings, that's data quality, that's data completeness. There's
Mhm.
other things in there that impact other parts of the organization. I'm oversimplifying, but trying to figure out, hey, if you get the information in quicker, faster, like what else is happening downstream? Because that starts to open up, who else does this impact? Who actually cares about this beyond your sort of level? Does it
So
start
like
to impact, does it start to impact things like my ability to do donor stewardship in a timely fashion? Like those things start to open up doors. You could certainly take the tact of jumping over somebody's head. I've never personally been like, that was never
nimble
my
enough to jump
style.
over anyone?
What's that?
You've never personally been nimble enough to physically jump over anyone?
Well, sure,
Because I disagree.
I could,
I think you
for
could.
sure.
Me.
I mean, all the time, Mark.
But so you're saying like the data quality that affects the donors, then eventually that rolls up to the development.
Yeah, and that's
path.
just one example. But the reality is, like, there's other folks that may be impacted. And here's another really quick example. In a membership organization like a museum, as an example, if somebody comes to the front gate to get in and they upsell, hey, do you want to buy a membership because it's $5 more and you get all these benefits? And I say, great, that's wonderful. Buy my ticket. By the time I get into the museum and back into like the gift shop, I'm now able to get a 10% discount. Like that needs to happen really quickly. I've had these calls where folks are like, hey, our integration doesn't work. And we get down this path and like, hey, what's the broader reach? Well, now a member might have a poor experience because they get to the gift shop and have frustration because they don't get their 10% discount. Well, hey, we're now reaching in to other impact to donors, members, and those types of things. So
Yeah, and it's probably a point to draw some clarification on as well, because somebody who oversees memberships, or we talked about like development, those are unique positions within the nonprofit world. Maria, since you've straddled both, can you help us understand like what, compare and contrast, like what would a development director, what would the equivalent be within a for-profit B2B setting, and how is that different between different types of nonprofits and mission areas of focus?
Yeah, well, development in the nonprofit world is all the activity required to bring money into the organization to fuel that mission. It's fundraising, it's P2P, it's philanthropy, it's charitable giving, lots of different names to it, but it's really everything you're doing to bring money into the organization. So in the for-profit
like a
world,
revenue director or sales director?
yeah, I was going to say like chief revenue officer or revenue director, sales, renewals, all the activity that's going to bring money into the organization. The difference obviously with nonprofits is it's fueling the mission, not adding value to the company necessarily. And I think development in the nonprofit world doesn't stop at just taking money. It's development of a revenue stream, something that's repeatable and reliable and you can count on year after year. So developing whatever that gift is, entree into the organization, into a revenue stream. Developing a donor base. Who is going to be collectively supporting your organization, hopefully through the years with different ways of giving, and then developing relationships. Building a lifetime value of somebody who may come to you through an event that might be their entry into your organization, but you want to welcome them in and cultivate them to a higher lifetime value. They take a second action. They give a bigger gift. They become an annual giver. Maybe they become a major donor and give over $10,000. Maybe they then become a campaign contributor and help build your next food warehouse. And ultimately, that you develop them to the point where they put you in their estate planning. So development is for...
You keep using the second person here, like you bring them in and you upsell them. Is it that everyone who works in development is having these conversations directly? Like, are they literally responsible for finding new donors and having conversations with them? Or are we talking about like some sort of organizational hierarchy where people are strategically saying, I've got a team of people who will have those conversations, or we have them in a digital sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, we could have, maybe this will be a future episode. We could really dig deep into the whole departmental structure under development, but it really is, think of it as the different ways that you, like you said, you bring money into the organization. It could be peer-to-peer, it could be major gifts, it could be estate planning, it could be direct mail, it could be digital fundraising. And so every nonprofit structures that a little bit differently, I would say. Does it fit together with marketing? Does the size of the organization allow each of those to have their own department? So it really depends on the size and scope of your organization, but you typically look at your revenue streams, group them together in like activity, and then build efficiency so that each revenue streams can generate the most interest, support, and revenue from their, their donor base, and potentially find new ones. So it's a whole structure, and it varies widely. But that's really a critical piece for you to understand or learn in your conversations. If you're selling to a nonprofit, where does your particular end user sit? What does that structure look like? Who do they report to? And who do they interact with? Kevin, that's a great point, because you can't make a decision anywhere in development without it having ripple effects and needing other departments to buy in, to understand, to support in order to make that happen. You can't do anything in a silo. And if you are that siloed, it's not very good for the organization. You've got to find ways to make sure that the work is intertwined and you're sharing resources and you're driving efficiency across fundraising, not just in your one singular department or revenue stream.
And some of the terms that you're using in there and that we've been using are traditional, like B2B terms. We talk about end users. That's a classic, like persona based. People think about, we have our end users, we have our influencers, our recommenders, our saboteurs, our decision makers. Yeah. Again, I'll throw it back to Casey, because you've had a variety of these conversations from truly the end user, lowest organizational hierarchy person who has no idea of what's happening anywhere else other than that one thing that they're working on, all the way up to the executive level. So can you talk about some of those personas that you've encountered along the way, and maybe the differences in the conversations between somebody who is like a low-level end user versus somebody who's more of an executive persona, or even someone who's like likely to be a saboteur within that organization?
Yeah, so for the end users, I typically like to think them, you're right, they're the day-to-day. They're the people that are getting into the product and using it for, to make their lives easier, to, reduce their manual tasks that they have to do day in and day out. And those are people that are typically, if you think of it, the larger organizations, peer-to-peer fundraisers, right? The digital marketing, the development managers. Those also could be like social coordinators, right? Like those are people that are having to engage and communicate with the communities digitally. So that could mainly, that's, focused on social media, but that also can broaden the scope of, digital channels. So that's email, website, all of those kind of like day-to-day tasks that end users are having to do and manage to make sure things are kind of like flowing smoothly, right? Keep the engine going. And their focus is mainly going to be on, the ease of use of the product. If they're working in SaaS, if you deliver a service to the nonprofit, they're looking for somebody who's going to help guide them, but give them consultative, like help, kind of give them kind of the answers to the test. Because sometimes coming into working in a new technology, or especially if this person is new to the nonprofit and they are a social media coordinator, or they're a digital marketer or digital development, or they're maybe even kind of newer to peer-to-peer fundraising, that is like them learning, drinking from the fire hose, both like within the organization as they're onboarding, but also like learning a new technology, right? So you're really going to kind of figure out there, like how you're going to help guide them.
Okay, then Maria, as someone who worked high level, if Casey is saying our end users are the people who care about, is this going to make my day-to-day tasks easier? From an executive level, do you care about that at all when you're talking to a vendor?
Actually, there is some of that, because as a high-level leader, you're managing staff. It could be 3 staff, it could be 300 staff. But part of your job as a leader is removing challenges and helping them be more effective in their job. So like prioritizing their work, taking things off their plate so they can do what they were hired to do. An example would be an event staff person. This is someone who is hired to put on an event. But the reality is they're not hired to do logistics. They're hired to find people to come to your event, to retain people that have attended your event, to get them to come back, to make sure you have the sponsors there at the table and they feel appreciated, relationship building, telling the community about the event. That's where you want your staff spending your time. You don't want them spending time finding a stage. So a vendor could come to a leader and talk about the efficiencies they're going to drive within that department that frees up time for that staff to focus on what's important. Is there a way to scale what you need done? So it's not 6 individuals doing the same thing, but you have technology for that to happen automatically. So I would say there is some level of that. They don't want to know the details, but they want to understand the overall impact from their perspective, how it's going to improve the work of the effectiveness of that organization and the work that they're doing in that department.
Well, I'm glad that you added on that last part, because when you said like executives actually do care, I think Kevin made a face like, maybe I don't believe you, but I will allow him to confirm or deny that, or
Right.
expound on your last point there, that they care a lot about like what the impact is going to have.
I used to, my eyes would glaze over and my staff would know when it was time for them to take the vendor away to talk details. Cause I just wanted to know over here, how much it's going to save us, how much it's going to raise us, how is it going to free up time? And that's all I wanted to know, and trust that, and let the end user or other individuals who are more tied to the technology side or the data collection, they figure out the detail. I don't want to know that. You don't have the capacity.
Yeah, so facial expressions aside, I was happy to hear that you cared, Maria. And I wouldn't say that's I think for a generalization, people that work in the nonprofit sector are generally empathetic people, and they generally care that folks on their team are in a good place. And so that was encouraging to hear. I have been in situations where an end user has had a challenge, wanted to solve it. It was just a headache for them to then talk to their leader, and they're like, I don't care. I want to keep them happy. If it's bothering them, it's bothering me. Like, I want to keep them happy because they're an important part of our organization. I've had that discussion, and it didn't bother them to sort of solve that problem for the sake of keeping and retaining somebody that was important to the organization. Like that has happened. I think more often than not, there still has to be tangible value to the organization that's going to advance the mission, increase the fundraising, decrease costs or time savings, or what have you, where there is that, hey, this is great. We're taking this headache off of this person's day-to-day, but let's be really clear. If we solve that problem, these are the other things that are going to be advantageous to the organization. And I think that's really important when you think about spending, because at some point that budget question comes up and they're going to have to make decisions to either fund that thing or not.
Right.
And so that's Maria mentioned, I care about, is it going to increase my revenue, decrease my costs, allow us to fund mission? If I get that, cool, let my team go deal with it. By the way, just high five for you to say that and say, hey, I'm empowering my team to go make these decisions.
Yeah, I was going to say too, Kevin, that's a great point about empowerment. I had the misconception when I first started working with nonprofits that like the executives had the decision-making power, but over time, I really started to see where they empowered their people who work day in and day out, those end users, to make those more informed decisions and like give them the recommendation. So they started becoming more like recommenders and influencers of the decisions that executives made in the budget. I'll give you an example too. Like the misconception that I walked in on was, when I work with end users, I'm working with people who may have what they consider like lower level like titles, and that's not true. To Mark's point about like the size of the organization, sometimes there's like, we talk about small organizations, we talk about large organizations, we also have like medium-sized organizations, right? They might be where they have employees of 200 people. I don't know for sure, so don't quote me on this, but I will give you an example of what I would consider more of a medium-sized organization, huge brand, does incredible work, the National Kidney Foundation. So I actually got to work directly with a director of development who oversaw a lot of the system and processes there. But they were also responsible for bringing in, new people to the organization, and they were empowered by their leadership team to come up with new ideas and initiatives to like bring in new people to the organization. And so they found value in being able to do that on social media because they had this like really large following on Facebook, a community of followers there. And so they were like, oh, well, this is a great opportunity for us. So back in 2024 of last year, they came to me and they were like, hey, we want to launch a social media fundraising campaign for this wonderful summer program called Camp Chimer. And what that does is it actually helps kids come in with end-stage renal disease. And I did not know this, but kids with end-stage renal disease cannot swim in a normal pool. They have to be in a filtered pool. And they came to me and they were like, hey, we have this camp that we host. It's I think only a 2-day camp, but we need people to help fund this camp. And our goal is about $15,000. We're going to do this multi-channel. We're going to ask people on social media to fundraise. We're going to ask people on our website. And then we're going to go into our local community because it's a local-based fundraiser. And we're going to go in and we're going to ask people to donate. So could you help us set this up? And I think that would have probably taken them maybe 10 hours to set it up on social media. And they came to us and we reduced their time by 80%. So a 2-hour setup between like setting up the fundraiser campaign, setting up the messaging that they want to communicate. And what that led to, though, ultimately was finding somebody on social media that helped them raise $2,000. And the impact there was that person helped raise 15% of those funds needed. And they never would have found that person if it wasn't for connecting them where they were on social media. And so that is like an impact statement and like a reason for why these director of development, the director of development is being empowered to go in and find future opportunities to build relationships with not only like at scale, but finding those people who could be potentially a lifetime donor, and you can grow that with them, as Maria, you mentioned.
And so I think it's an interesting example. You mentioned there, Casey, of the leadership empowering people to kind of go out and find and make their own decisions. I think it's also an example of titles being maybe misleading or, I don't want to say irrelevant, but difficult to navigate. I think all of us have probably been in those situations where we would assume one person does or doesn't have decision-making authority when it comes to a budget based on their title. And in the nonprofit world, it could be really difficult. So Maria, can you talk about who the people are at nonprofits who have the control or the authority to make those budgetary decisions?
Sure. I mean, it probably varies, again, as Kevin alluded in the beginning, to the size and scope of the organization. But I would say that there's probably a number, a threshold, where a department head could make their own decision. If it's, a small enough amount in context of their big budget, a good leader will give them the power and the ability to make a decision on a small spend. If it's a little bit larger spend, it's probably going to go to a VP or a chief who's going to have to look at that budget in light of the entire, department, not just one singular one, but all the activity that they are overseeing. Because like Kevin said earlier, you may have to make a decision. Do you reduce another budget here in order to fund this because you think it's a bigger investment. So oftentimes that chief has to look at the big picture. But you also, many times, if it is a large investment, have finance involved. They're going to want to know what's the spend, what's the potential ROI, what will the forecasting look like at the end of the year, what's it going to look like on our balance sheet? How does it affect net operating? And then sadly, legal is probably going to be involved. If it's a big ask and it's the first time you're working with this, if it's the first time you're working with this nonprofit, they're going to want to make sure that the contract, if you provide a contract, that it meets all of their approvals, that they have vetted the vendor, that they're legit, and that, they are covering themselves. They're not going to get screwed in some way if your company goes out of business or, whatever the people sometimes involved too in those big decisions.
So how do you, Kevin, you've been at it for selling to nonprofits, what, roughly 100 years, 120 years now. How do you know? Maria keeps saying, like, if it's a large organization at this dollar amount, it might have to go up, or legal might review it. How do you know the answers to what those levels are?
Yeah. I'm going to go and just say some assumptions. Some assumptions meaning I've done my due diligence and learned about problem, provided, hey, we have a valuable solution that could solve this problem, assuming we're on the same page with whoever we're dealing with at that point in time. You get to a point where, okay, we're in agreement. It makes sense for us to move forward and start to talk about dollars and cents and budget and so forth. You have to get those things sort of cleared before you start to ask questions about process and deeper things. Assuming those things are true and we're all in agreement, hey, we have something that actually can solve a problem, I then have the ability to ask more questions around, hey, when you've made purchases like this before, what does the process look like? And leave it for sort of open-ended. You can also do some things like, hey, in my experience, I'll take healthcare as a really good example. I would not assume in any opportunity where I was working with a healthcare hospital foundation that a legal entity would not be involved.
Yeah.
Every time. Working with a higher ed institution, there's even more stringent processes. And I could come into that conversation and say,
but pause for a moment though. Why? I think we take for granted, because we've been doing this for a while, that what you just said is true. Why would we assume that to be the case almost 100% of the time?
Liability factors. They have a lot of guardrails around things like HIPAA compliance, and the way they work with vendors needs to have a lot of checks and balances before you can be an approved vendor. And that's just one vertical that just has a lot of, for lack of a better term, red tape. Mm-hmm. And they have a lot of focus on liability, and therefore their legal departments are always in the midst of reviewing contracts, making sure that data security is a big factor. They're going to look through that to make sure, that you're meeting all of their standards, as an example. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And it's the other thing I would point out is that we're talking a lot about what's the functional, we used to call it the paper process of what do you literally have to do as a part of this budgetary experience. And we've talked about what are they responsible within their day to day. To go a level deeper and kind of talk a little bit more about this, because I think it's extremely important in the nonprofit world to break beyond just the functional day to day. What are you responsible for? Because we talk a lot about that in the B2B sales environment, about what are the jobs that this person is responsible for? What are the pains? What are the things that makes it difficult? What are the functional things that you could do to make it better? But we often miss those things that are more social and emotional. And Casey, I know you and I both have had a trial by fire around those deeper kind of social and emotional jobs and pains and gains. Can you talk a little bit further about why that's so important, specifically in the nonprofit world?
Yeah, I'm just taking myself back to when I first learned about how much influence social and emotional decisions make in renewals and even potential buying. I had I laugh a little bit because
You don't have to
I had
name names, by the way.
I'm not
I feel
naming
about
names.
you
I will
can-
not be doing
you can
that. No,
certainly
no, no.
just speak anonymously.
No, I had a rude awakening, though, I would say, as a customer success manager. When I was in my first year, I was just coming out of that first year, and we had set up, like, understanding the organization's goals, how much money they're trying to raise, what value we're driving from a monetary level. And through the whole process of managing that relationship, I thought we had it. I was like, okay, we have two people even on this account, right? We have me, and we had person that was dedicated to help optimizing metrics for that organization. And so, like, if you're looking at it from that, like a health score and what you think is going to be a potential renewal, I was like, oh, we got this. We're crushing it. We helped them raise like $1 million. Like, why wouldn't they want to continue working with us? And I realized perception was reality, and we didn't go a level deeper, and making sure that we were doing our best and building up trust, but how we communicated with them was really, really important. Maria mentioned this in our last podcast about how you make someone feel, how your company makes you feel. And while we had the best intentions and we thought we were doing right by them, there were things in hindsight when we did a review after they said, you know what, we're not going to renew with you. I was shocked when I got that call. I was like, whoa, why? Completely caught off guard. And they gave me the reasons. And those reasons had nothing to do with their day-to-day job. It had everything to do with how they felt about working with us. And when we look back and when we talk about social, it's about how you make someone feel secure, a thought leader, really diving into what they're trying to get out of working with you. How are they trying to look within their organization, and how are they trying to look as an individual? Because a lot of these people that are working in the nonprofits, y'all talk about limitations that they have. There's a lot of limitations to being able to move up in an organization and be promoted. And so when you think about the social aspect of it, they want to look good to their leadership team. They want to look good to their peers. And so, when communicating with that person that we were working with, when we had, monthly conversations, positioning how you talk to them about being innovative with them. I didn't realize how important for them it was to feel like they were coming to the table as being an innovative partner. And so when we had a conversation with them about how we could optimize metrics, let's say, for instance, we had said to them, oh, we've done this with a couple other organizations, and we've proven it. And for them, they didn't give us that feedback right away. But from them, it was like a slap in the face almost that we didn't come to them first, And so that was just one of the dings that we got and why we didn't renew. But that is a prime example of, like, you have to come prepared with explaining, like, how you communicate, those recommendations to them. But you really, at the beginning, need to better understand what they're getting out of that relationship with you at the end of the day.
That's a great example, and it reminds me of one that is very relevant to myself and Maria. And it reminds me that you don't often see how you're perceived on that social and emotional level from the people that you're working with. I had over a decade of experience in working and helping nonprofits, and had worked with an organization for over 2 years. Maria had come in and helped work with that organization, and she had quickly developed a great relationship. They very much trusted her because of her background in the nonprofit space. And I remember a conversation we had where we checked in, and I said, Maria, this seems like it's going really well. What was the feedback that they had? Maria, do you remember what they told you about why they felt so comfortable now?
Because finally somebody worked at our company that understood nonprofits.
Finally. So on one level, it was obviously such a blow to my ego that I will remember that story till the day that I die. But it's also one of those ones where you have to understand, like, there's nothing truly that I could have done to win the trust on a level that Maria would have gathered because of her history and understanding of nonprofits. There was a level deeper that there's no amount of, to your point earlier, Casey, data, ROI numbers. There's nothing I could have said that would have proven my knowledge in the space beyond the kind of deeper trust and relationship piece of it.
Yeah.
Kevin, there's an old sales maxim about, like, people, buy from people that they trust or know. Do you think it's more true or more pronounced in the nonprofit world?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would be inclined to say yes. And the reason I say that is because the level of influence that I see from trusted advisors in this space is paramount. Like, I don't know that there's any, I shouldn't say any, a lot of deals and opportunities that I see move forward now have a layer of influence, meaning a consultant or, hey, a nonprofit down the street that I work with and trust, or there's some resource in the space that has some level of credibility that I look towards to say, hey, am I moving in the right sort of direction? A lot of times that comes down to, oh yeah, I've worked with that company, they're doing good things. That's a layer of credibility and trust, down to even the individual that you're working with. Like, oh, I've worked with Kevin. He's really good. He's done these things for my organization. Here's how we work with him. That personal brand, if you will, carries a lot of weight. And I'll go back to when I was selling into some of the national accounts that I had. And that was a little bit unique in the fact that I could get really deep into their business practice and understanding that. But I had built a personal brand. When people came to me, or when I was talking with folks within that brand, I had a lot of knowledge. I had a lot of connections. I had a lot of understanding of their core business challenges. And ultimately, that just brought a lot of credibility. That credibility I couldn't replace or replicate. You couldn't take somebody and just throw them in and take my seat the next day and have that same layer. And that to me has always been a pretty prominent component. And so that whole, like, people buy from people that they trust, I mean, I've seen that come to fruition. I think on the flip side of that, in more of a for-profit setting, I don't know that necessarily holds as much weight. I probably have more experience in the nonprofit side, but I think the reality is, like, there's usually more spend and more appetite to take risks and some other things that you don't necessarily see the same way here in the nonprofit sector.
So I think a good way then to maybe cap off this episode, I'll give everyone a minute to think about it, but I'd love to go around and hear advice to someone who is, as a company or as an individual, selling to nonprofits and it's relatively new. What advice would you give them to help start to build the trust or the better way to gain that level of understanding about the social and emotional impact to nonprofits? So I'll start, Maria, I'll pick on you first. What's advice that you would have to somebody?
Yeah, I would say that relationship building is critical to build trust, but it shouldn't always only be with the end user or potentially the even the decision maker, whether or not a conversation goes forward. At the same time, in parallel, your CEO, someone of a higher level, should instantly be trying to reach out and build a relationship with an appropriate higher level in the organization. It's a different layer. And it does, as Kevin said, solidify reputation, knowing they can call you in the back channel if they have a question that didn't get answered or they have a concern that they don't want to talk about, with their staff. But having it takes work, and you have to really plot out who's the appropriate person to reach out to, the CDO or the CEO. But it's worth it in the end because you have two layers of perception, and sometimes a story via telephone doesn't get up to the leaders in the same way. And so, but you having that channel is really an important part. So I would say that relationship building.
If you have to pick up the bat phone, and I think that's a podcast episode in and of itself.
It
right?
is.
The man-to-man defense of everyone at your organization having a relationship
Right.
with that level of hierarchy. Okay, Casey, advice to someone who is new in this space on ways to build trust or understand these individuals better.
Yeah, so my advice is when you identify who's going to be your main point of contact to work with you, you need to have a one-on-one with them. I'm talking about, don't even worry about Zoom necessarily. Call them up and have a conversation to better understand what they're going through in their lives. They will open up to you more than they would ever on a Zoom call, especially if there's others around. And they can really kind of give you like the grit, the no shit version. I'm going to go there of what's going on in their lives and who they work with. You want to uncover from them who they work with. Let's say it's a larger organization, for instance, what departments they work with closely, because that's going to help you kind of identify how you can start to build a relationship with those departments. Because the work that they're doing, let's say you're doing work with a digital marketer. They're going to be your main point of contact. They're going to be mainly focused on acquisition, but it's really to embed yourself and ingrain yourself into their organization, and the value you can drive is going to be about what your service offers, obviously. But let's say your SaaS product can not only help them acquire new people, but then start to build relationships with their donors, let's say. You want to be able to work with the person that's going to be your champion, your director of marketing, but you want to get to know who's going to be their point person for getting them. Let's say maybe you want to have a relationship with the person that's going to be managing their development going forward. You want to be able to then start to guide and help that director of marketing connect you, the person that is selling, or even the person that's going to be working with them as a customer success manager, to start to be able to develop that relationship with the development person. Because then you're going to have a mutually beneficial outcome and value for both of them. And then you probably will have less of a saboteur in your future.
And then I'll give the last word on relationships to Kevin, who seemingly everyone knows in the nonprofit tech for good industry, the person who has the most relationships. I'll allow to give the last word of advice on how to build those relationships.
Yeah, I guess I'll keep it relatively. There's so many different directions I could go on this one, but I'm going to say genuine, authentic curiosity is easiest step number one. And you asked the question from hey, somebody new into this sector. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to know more than the person you're talking to. You may not even know how your solution solves all of their problems. When we do training, we always talk about it. It always starts with discovery and learning. And the only way you're going to learn is if you're genuinely curious about what they're doing, what their mission is like, how this is causing problems. And I'll give one brief example. There was an account executive I was working with to mentor, and I listened to his calls. And when he would hear a buzzword, he wanted to jump in and tell all the things. So he heard this one word, automation. And then he jumped in, let me tell you about all our automation. And he lost everything when he was in a discovery call. I said, listen, the next time you hear that buzzword and you want to jump out and start talking about automation, stop, take a breath, and just ask a question like, why is that important, or what have you. Be curious about it. And man, that changed how much he was getting in his discovery calls, and it made more connection with the organization and his understanding of their business and where solving these challenges was going to take. So genuine curiosity, can't go wrong with that.
That was the be from Ted Lasso quoting a famous author about be curious, not judgmental.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hopefully, everybody who is listening got something from this podcast episode. We'll continue to do these weekly, so make sure that you like, rate, share, subscribe. You can get this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also visit us at constantmethod.com. And until next week, thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time.